Assalamualaikum, everyone. This is Muhi Khwaja with the Muslim Philanthropy Podcast. Today we have on the show Richard Geary, and I'm looking forward to introducing him and sharing more about the program he runs called Deaf Reach. So Richard is the founder and director of programs of Deaf Reach, which is the leading program of Family Educational Services Foundation, a nonprofit educational foundation operating in Pakistan for over 3 decades. He's worked in the field of deaf education for the past 50 years with nonprofits in over 10 different countries across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Richard was recently awarded the 2020 Sitara-e-Khidmat Award by the President of Pakistan for outstanding service to Pakistan. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here, and Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. So, I've got a lot of questions, but first, maybe you'll
What's a
answer
guy like
them.
me living in Pakistan? That's the first one I know everybody has.
So yeah, would love to hear more about yourself, your journey. You can go back to where you were born and grew up and on this long journey of nonprofit service for over 50 years. Just fascinated to kind of hear and learn, and if you can share some wisdom along the way, we'd appreciate
The wisdom part, we'll see what comes, but
it.
but yeah, I actually it's been more than 50 years now, and my wife and I have been living here in Pakistan for the past 36 years. So we're now American Pakistanis, if you will.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, if we want to go way back, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio,
Okay.
a nice Midwestern boy. And when I went to university at Washington University in St. Louis. And while I was in uni, I got involved in a lot of, sort of on-campus volunteer programs. I ultimately transferred to Ohio State and started working with kids who were on the street, who had drug problems. Eventually, though, I entered a pre-med program and was on a pathway to become a doctor, to meet my family's expectations.
Hmm.
But I took a break year and went overseas and did volunteer work. It was a similar organization to like the Peace Corps, but not quite as structured. But I ended up living in a few countries. It was very engaging and intriguing, and I never looked back. I've now spent the last 55 years of my life
Wow.
working in nonprofits. Um, my wife and I, my wife, who's from the Philippines, by the way, um, we're parents of a deaf child.
Mm.
And when we were in the Philippines, this was in the late 70s, early 80s, we had started a small project, which we called Deaf Reach. I mean, our son was deaf. We thought, well, if God gave us a deaf child, let's do something with it. It was, very challenging. Being a parent of a child with a disability is always not only challenging, it was very discouraging. I was like, why me? And a wise pastor said to me at that time, he said, well, something like this can make you bitter or better. It's a choice you have
Mm.
to make. But
Wow.
the things you learn taking care of that one child one day could benefit many. And that's really proven to be true. So we started this small project in the Philippines, and then we went to India. We spent a few years in India, actually. We were in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, and we were doing programs in all the different states of Gujarat for schools for the deaf.
Hmm.
Uh, or you have an Indian background, perhaps you might
Yeah.
recognize those names.
Hmm.
Uh, Quite an interesting experience. We were independent. We didn't even have any big support from any group particularly. But while we were in India, we had gotten a letter from someone whom we knew in Karachi. He was working in the social development sector. He said, you guys aren't far away. Can you come help me on a project for a few months? We said, sure, let's go. We were adventuresome. And in those days, it was just a simple train ride from Delhi down to Karachi. And we helped him out. And while we were here, a business friend of ours Said, look, I have a small office space in the heart of the city. It's an area called Sunder, very congested. He said, if I give it to you, can you do something with it? We said, okay, fine. So we started, literally, it was a one-room office, and we started our first little Deaf Reach Center there. We had about 15 to 20 deaf teenagers coming who wanted to learn English, wanted to learn literacy, wanted to get a job, and we were teaching them. And slowly but surely, some parents heard about this and said, oh, now we have some small deaf children. You know, Hamare bache deaf, kya kare? I said, okay, please, yeah, bring them over. We'll do
Hmm.
something. We started our first little primary class. So we had two classes, one for the younger kids, one for the older teens. That was in 1989. And from those small beginnings, this has just grown organically over the years, to where today we now have 9 large campuses across 9 cities in Pakistan, each campus having around 250 to 350 students.
Wow.
Um, we've opened smaller satellite campuses in dozens of areas where, you know, deaf education in Pakistan is so neglected. Deaf children are so marginalized.
Mm.
Um, and the statistics are quite impact. I mean, you've got over 1 million deaf children in Pakistan, and hardly 5% have access to education.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's bigger than some countries, right? So, and if you look at the deaf community, not so much as a disability group, but as a minority culture that just speaks a different language, which is their signed
Yeah.
language, then if you can give them education and training in their language, everything's possible. Sab cheez kar sakte.
Yeah.
And so that was always our motto, and it's proven true. Now we have our schools go from pre-primary all the way up through a Bachelor of Arts college program, one of the few for higher education for deaf children in the country. Our graduates, we have a very proactive job placement program. In the last few years, we've provided over 2,500 jobs for deaf graduates. And slowly but surely, we're changing the mindset, if you will. I mean, it's a lot to overcome. There's a
Hmm.
lot of, you know, antiquated sort of thought patterns about children with disabilities, you know, a lot of superstition, a lot of inappropriate, you know, views. But not only does it need to change, but we're happy to say it is changing. There's still a long
Yeah.
way to, but you know, we're making our dent in the universe, I think, in that regard.
Very, very impressive. And, can you tell us a little bit more about that journey? Like one thing that stuck out to me is you said literally a letter was sent to you. So you may have to explain to some listeners who are younger what a letter is. But
It was before the internet, mind you.
right, right. But just seeing that spirit of wanting to be in service of other people, helping others out on a project that they needed help with, and just following that journey is really inspiring. Um, for for when you got to Pakistan, was your son already born at that time, or tell us a little bit more about um, through the challenges that you faced, wanting to do something to help not only your child but other children in a similar way, and kind of was it just word of mouth that you guys had this office space, or were starting educational programs, and tell us a little bit more about how that naturally grew.
Well, actually, our son was a young teen at the time. He was about 13, 14 years old. And by the way, he's passed away since. So
Mm,
in a sense, this is his legacy. That comment that that gentleman made about taking care of one child one day will benefit many, it truly has come to pass.
mm,
Um, but when we started that small center, this was truly just a little mom and pop shop, obviously, of my wife and myself and our son and his younger
yeah.
brother.
Mm,
Um, and we didn't advertise. There was no profit involved. We were just doing this on a very shoestring budget.
Sure.
And the word of mouth went around the deaf community, and those that were interested came, and they came in large numbers, actually, to the point that we didn't have enough space to accommodate them. There's very few quality facilities for deaf children in Pakistan, especially at that time.
Yeah.
So we were able, through some donors that we engaged with here locally, and I have to take a minute to say that the Pakistan community has been very supportive.
Hmm.
To their credit, that all these years our work has grown and flourished through their support.
Yeah.
80% of our support does come from the local community. Of course, we
Wow.
are also reaching out, globally, because this work has, not only has it grown, it has so much more it needs to grow, and that
Right.
support becomes very foundational. But in those beginning days, this was just a very local work with no real additional people involved. And as our population of students increased and we actually realized, hey, wait a minute, we have a school here. we
Right.
need to legitimize this. So we got it registered. And by that time, we had about 60, 70 students. And we hired our very first teacher, who was
Wow.
deaf himself. He was one of our students, very bright boy.
Mm.
His name is Ali. And he's still with us today. He's one of our regional managers, actually.
Nice.
And those early years in Pakistan were challenging. I mean, here we're foreigners, strangers in a strange land. Um, People suspected our motives, and which I don't blame them. It takes time to build trust. It takes time to build that, credibility, if you will.
Yeah.
But again, I have to say the Pakistan community has been so supportive, so receptive in that regard. And, I think it's one of the most hospitable cultures in the world, and one of the most
Sure.
philanthropic as well. And we've lived in so many countries, but I find that to be more true in Pakistan than many other places.
Hmm.
Uh, and as our work has grown over the years, of course, that support has grown, and we've had to hire. I mean, running a school now, see the building behind me there? I'll move my head out
Sure.
of.
On your Zoom screen. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a little story. I love to tell this story because it's
Please
the
do.
miracles, if you will, of Pakistan. There was a retired Air Force Commodore. His name is Commodore Shabir. He's a philanthropist. He had visited us when we had just our small school in Karachi, and he was very inspired. He said, look, I have a project in the interior part of Sindh where I'm putting up buildings for organizations. I want to build like a city that will support the needs of underprivileged people. And there's
Mm.
hospitals and there's schools, but I would love to have a school for deaf children there. If I build it for you, would you take it and run it? And we said, Cello, okay. People say a lot of things, right? So you
Right.
never
Yeah.
know, you're never sure where that's going to go. But to his credit, he started building. And what you see behind us there is the result thereof. He put this up, is on a 2-acre campus. We have room for 400 children there. And we opened this now in 2015. And we have close to 400 students. And it's the first school for the deaf in that whole area. It's in an area between Mir Prakash and Hyderabad, about 3.5 hours from Karachi.
Okay.
And we did all this on a handshake. This is a $2 million project. When we cut the ribbon, he said, I'm old, you're old, we better sign some agreement. So we made an MOU,
Yeah.
memorandum of understanding. And we have it now on a 100-year lease, and we pay $1 a month rent.
That's beautiful.
That beautiful story. And now 400 children are getting an education. It goes up to the college program. They're getting jobs. This impacts all their families. It just changes their lives. So I think that's a beautiful testimony to the type of support that's there and the community cooperation that's available.
Absolutely. I'm assuming that, your organization's also registered in the United States for people in the US who want to support. What is the legal name in the USA for people who want to look up, and what's the website?
It's called Deaf Reach North America, and you just go to deafreachna.org and you'll find us there. We're a 501c3. And yes, we would welcome support, particularly from the Pakistani diaspora. And more than even support, we would welcome you to visit us when you come to Pakistan.
Absolutely. Um, in terms of kind of, beyond the education, you were talking about job creation. Tell us a little bit more about some of the beneficiaries in the programs and kind of how it has not only changed their lives, but, has provided resolve to a lot of families who were maybe feeling hopeless in the situation and challenges that they were facing and not receiving adequate care and resources, and how your organization has helped step in where maybe government services were lacking or other means were not available.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question and very accurate description of, not only are deaf children marginalized, but the families of deaf children, the majority of whom are, come from low economic backgrounds, low education backgrounds, particularly those in the rural areas. They're without information and most of the times without hope. And in fact, often they'll treat their deaf children as if they have some intellectual disability. They keep them from school, they keep them from education, which is very sad because there's so much potential there. But our employment program has been very impactful in that regard, because not only are you providing an educational pathway, but then a way for a child to become self-reliant and earn. And we have so many stories of our graduating students now supporting their families. One of our girls who graduated last year from this same school you see behind me, her father was just a rickshaw driver. She had 4 brothers. She was the only girl, but she's graduated now and she's got a job in a bank in a managerial position, not just as a, and she's earning and supporting her whole family.
That's great.
Yeah. So what, I mean, when we started our employment program, our first partner was KFC restaurants. KFC in Pakistan is an elite restaurant, right? It's not just like for mostly people that are somewhat moneyed will go to a KFC.
Yeah.
And we started the first deaf-run KFC where the people behind the counter were deaf. When you went to order, you were the one that's handicapped because you don't know how to give them your order. It doesn't matter how loud you say zinger, right? So, by the way, that's a sign for zinger.
Nice.
Z sandwich, yeah. So we made big printed menus where all the handicapped people could point. But that one deaf KFC was outperforming all the other branches because people would go out of their way. They wanted to learn sign language. It had a meaning to it, right? And now today, KFC has over 70 branches across Pakistan, and they employ over 200 deaf boys and girls. And what that did, though, back in the day, this was 20 years ago when we started that, this created a model that others in the corporate sector could follow, where they realized that, hey, disability is not a barrier. We just need to be more inclusive. And that has actually proven to be true. And now many of the corporates are hiring people with disabilities. The government's more involved. In Pakistan, having these type of collaborations with the private sector, with the government sector, we're a small organization. We're not big, but we're able to have a big footprint because of those kind of collaborations.
My own understanding of hard of hearing community, deaf people, may be limited. And I'm assuming that many of the other people who may watch or listen to this podcast may also not know. So can you share a little bit more about, whether, there's things like cochlear implants or um, other technology that may be assistive, but beyond learning sign language and providing education using sign language and things like that, are there other ways in which Deaf Reach NA is helping in the community?
Well, you know, cochlear implants are a great innovation. They're not a magic bullet. It's
Sure.
sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. They're
Hmm.
best done before a child is 2 or 3 years of age. It takes a lot of follow-up, a lot of training, a lot of speech therapy,
Hmm.
and it's super expensive, particularly in a place like Pakistan. So it's not really a solution for the larger deaf community in a place like Pakistan, in a developing country.
Hmm.
Uh, Hearing aids work if there's a mild to moderate hearing loss, but the majority of children are profoundly deaf, and hearing aids don't really do very much. So
Got it.
the real rehabilitation, if you will, for a deaf child is an educational pathway.
Hmm.
And to provide that educational pathway, it needs to be in their native language, which is their signed language.
Right.
Interestingly enough, sign language is not universal, it's indigenous to every country.
Hmm.
So in Pakistan, it's called Pakistan Sign Language.
Sure.
There's American Sign Language and there's
Yeah.
British Sign Language and Australian Sign Language. It has nothing to do with English. So, I mean, that's a whole other subject that we won't get too deep. But we developed, I have to share this, we developed the first ever digital Pakistan Sign Language Dictionary, which is online, and you can
Okay.
access it at psl.org.pk. That's not Pakistan Super League, that's Pakistan Sign Language. And there's an app on the Google Play Store and on the Apple Store, and you can start learning on your phone.
Really impressive. Um, if you could share a piece of advice to somebody who wants to start their nonprofit journey, what would you share with them?
I think it's one thing just to stick. You know, things can get difficult, things can get challenging, but if you believe in what you're doing, you'll find a way through the challenges. There's one law that reigns supreme in Pakistan, and it's Murphy's Law. If something can
Mm.
go wrong, it will go wrong. And you just have to learn to work around it or work, through it. And I think building relationships with others in the community, with like-minded other organizations, individuals, these are keys because, you can't do these things on your own. It takes a real team to make things happen. And, I'd like to close because I realize we're approaching 9 o'clock just by giving a little note to those who are watching this and to the donor community there in the US that,
Sure.
we would love to have you engage with you, share more about what we're doing, and with your help, build more capacity because there's so much more to be done.
Absolutely. I, want to express my gratitude for you sharing more about Deaf Reach North America. Again, people can go to deafreachna.org to learn more. And I highly encourage everybody who's watching or listening to learn more about the fantastic work that Richard has founded and his team is implementing. So thank you so much for being on the show and for sharing with all of us a little bit more about how we can be more supportive and learn more about the work that you're doing.
Thank you too, Mui. I appreciate it. Here's how you
Great.
clap in sign language, by the way.
Excellent.
Allah
That one I
Hafiz.
knew. That one I knew.
Very good. Thank you.
Yep. Bye bye.